Kai was given a rocky plot as a joke, but what he found hidden. Harold Mitchell received the most humiliating call of his life at 67. The attorney for his younger brother, Dennis, who had passed 3 months prior, couldn't hide the mocking tone in his voice. While the nephews inherited the city houses and bank accounts, all that was left for him was a rocky plot of land in the countryside of Kentucky. When Dorothy, his wife of 42 years, learned of the ridiculous inheritance, she shook her head in dismay. It was just another one of the family disputes that had followed them for decades. She begged him to sell that land without even seeing it. But Harold felt something burning in his chest. It wasn't just wounded pride. It was as if Dennis were laughing at him even after departing this world. "I won't give anyone that satisfaction, Dorothy. We're going to see this land with our own eyes," he declared with the stubbornness she knew so well. Dorothy sighed deeply, knowing that arguing would be useless. After 4 decades together, she had learned that when Harold dug his heels in on a decision, moving a mountain would be easier than changing his mind. 2 days later, they were on the road heading to the countryside. The old car rattled on the dirt roads, and Dorothy held tightly to the door handle. The GPS led them down increasingly narrow paths, passing small farms and cornfields that stretched as far as the eye could see. "Just look at this, Harold. There isn't even a proper road. How did your brother end up in a place like this?" complained Dorothy, feeling every pothole in the road. Harold didn't answer. He was focused on finding the property that, according to the attorney's map, was past the 3rd fence on the right side of the main road. When they finally arrived, both fell silent for a long minute. The land was even worse than they had imagined. Stones of all sizes covered almost the entire area. Tall weeds grew among the rocks, and there wasn't even a decent tree for shade. The midday sun beat down mercilessly, and Dorothy already felt drops of sweat trickling down her forehead. "Good heavens, Harold. This isn't even fit for planting cactus." "What a cruel thing your brother did to you," said Dorothy, shielding her eyes from the sun with her hand. Harold got out of the car slowly. His back wasn't what it used to be when he worked in construction, but he still had strength in his arms. He walked among the stones, stepping carefully so as not to trip. The plot was about 5 acres, all covered by that endless array of rocks. 40 years working as a bricklayer, and my brother leaves me a pile of stone. What irony, he murmured, kicking a smaller rock with his foot. Dorothy stayed near the car, where she had found a small patch of shade. She watched her husband walking the land as if inspecting a construction site. She knew that determined look. Harold was planning something, and she feared what it might be. "Let's go soon, my love. We've seen enough. We can call a realtor tomorrow," she suggested, hoping he would agree. But Harold had stopped in front of a larger rock, almost chest-high. There was something different about it. It wasn't covered in moss like the others, and it seemed to have been moved recently. Curiously, it was positioned on a smaller base, as if someone had placed it there on purpose. "Dorothy, come look at this," he called without taking his eyes off the stone. "Oh, Harold, what is it now?" "I'm already tired of this sun," she complained, but walked toward him. When she got close, she also noticed the oddity. The large rock was clearly out of place, as if it had been used to cover something. Harold ran his hands around the base, looking for a way to move it. "You're not going to try to lift that rock, are you? Remember your back," warned Dorothy, worried. "I just want to see what's underneath. Help me here," he asked, positioning his hands on one side. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to leave a like, and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot, as we're just starting out, now continuing. Dorothy shook her head but positioned herself on the other side of the stone. Together, they managed to roll it aside, revealing a small hole dug in the earth, and inside it, to the surprise of both, was a rusty metal box about the size of a shoebox. "My God, what could this be?" whispered Dorothy, bringing her hand to her chest. Harold picked up the box carefully. It was heavy and covered in rust, but still seemed solid. There was a small padlock that resisted his attempts to force it open. "It must have been buried here for years. Who could have hidden this?" asked Dorothy, looking around as if someone might be watching. "There's only one way to find out. Let's take it home and find a way to open it," decided Harold, storing the box inside one of the suitcases they had brought. The trip back was tense, Dorothy couldn't stop looking at the suitcase containing the mysterious box, while Harold drove in silence, lost in thought. What kind of person would bury a box in such an inhospitable piece of land? And why right there? Arriving home on the outskirts of Indianapolis, Harold went straight to the garage to get his tools. The padlock gave way easily with a pair of pliers, revealing it was more rusted than it seemed. When he opened the lid of the box, both held their breath. Inside were several documents wrapped in plastic, some hand-drawn maps on yellowed paper, and some old coins that didn't seem to have much value. Dorothy carefully pulled out one of the sheets, fearing it might crumble to the touch. "Look here, Harold. There's an old deed. And this map. It seems to be of the area we went to today," she said, spreading the papers on the kitchen table. Harold put on his glasses and leaned over the documents. There were certificates dating from the 19th century, mentioning Traders' Rest and King's Highway. The map clearly showed the land they had visited, but with markings indicating buildings that no longer existed. Traders. This talks about traders, Dorothy. That area must have been an old trade route, said Harold, his voice growing with excitement. Dorothy continued examining the papers. There were also some pencil notes in more modern handwriting, mentioning stone foundations and possible historic site. The handwriting seemed familiar, but she couldn't place it. "Harold, look at this handwriting here. Doesn't it remind you of someone?" she asked, pointing to the notes. He looked closer and felt a chill. It was his brother Dennis's handwriting. Unmistakable with that slanted style he'd known since childhood, it meant Dennis knew about these documents, and probably about everything they revealed. "That bastard knew something and didn't tell me," grumbled Harold, but there was more curiosity than anger in his voice. Dorothy found one last sheet at the bottom of the box. It was a handwritten letter, clearly recent. When she recognized Dennis's handwriting, she called Harold. "There's a letter here. It's from your brother," she said, her voice choked. Harold took the paper with trembling hands. The letter was short but direct. "Harold, if you're reading this, it means you were stubborn enough to go see the land with your own eyes. I always knew you wouldn't sell without seeing it. This place has a history I discovered by chance 5 years ago. The papers will explain everything. Don't let the boys know anything yet. This is our brother's secret. Dennis." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of cars passing on the street. Dorothy gently touched her husband's arm, seeing tears forming in his eyes. "He knew, Dorothy. Dennis knew I would go after the truth. That's why he left the land to me," said Harold, his voice breaking. They spent the entire night studying the documents. They discovered the land had been an important stopping point for muleteers, who transported gold and other goods between Kentucky and Charleston in the 18th century. The foundations Dennis mentioned in his notes were probably from buildings from that time. The next morning, Harold announced his decision. "We're going back there, Dorothy, and this time we're going to dig." "Dig? Harold, have you lost your mind? We're not archaeologists," protested Dorothy. "You don't need to be an archaeologist to dig a few holes. I want to see those foundations Dennis found," he said with determination. 2 days later, they were back on the land, this time equipped with shovels, pickaxes, and even a small ladder Harold insisted on bringing. Dorothy had prepared a bag with water and sandwiches, sensing it would be a long day. The sun was already high when Harold began removing stones from the area indicated on the map. Dorothy positioned herself in the shade of a scrawny bush, watching her husband work with the energy of someone 20 years younger. "Be careful with your back, Harold," she shouted when she saw him straining too hard to lift a large rock. "I'm fine, woman. Look at this here," he replied, pointing to where he had removed some rocks. Dorothy approached and saw there was indeed something different in the soil. They weren't just loose stones, but what looked like a constructed wall, buried under decades of earth and vegetation. "My God, it's true. There's some construction down here," said Dorothy, touching the remains of the wall with her hand. Motivated by the discovery, Harold worked with even more diligence. He soon discovered there was not just one wall, but the complete outline of a small rectangular building. The stones used in the construction were different from those scattered around the land, clearly worked and placed with purpose. Around noon, when they stopped to rest, a man approached walking down the road. He was older than them, probably around 70, and wore a worn straw hat. Good day. I'm Walter. I live on the farm over there. I saw you here yesterday and again today. Is this land yours? He asked kindly. Yeah, I inherited it from my brother, just taking a look around, replied Harold, not mentioning what he was doing. Ah, then you must be relatives of Dennis. He used to come here from time to time, always messing with these stones. Said there was some old history around here, said Walter, taking off his hat to fan himself. Dorothy and Harold exchanged glances. It was further confirmation that Dennis knew exactly what he was doing when he left the land to Harold. What else did he say about this place? Asked Dorothy, curious. Oh, he was kind of reserved, but once he mentioned that the old folks said this was a muleteer's rest. My grandfather, God rest him, always told stories about the men who passed through here with their mules loaded with gold, said Walter, his eyes shining with memories. A muleteer's rest? Repeated Harold, feigning surprise. Yes, indeed. They say there was even a small chapel here, where travelers would stop to give thanks for arriving alive. They were dangerous times with many bandits on the road, explained the neighbor. After Walter said goodbye, Harold and Dorothy returned to work with even more enthusiasm. If there really was a chapel buried there, it could be an important discovery. Harold began to dig at one end of the structure, where Dennis's map indicated an entrance. It was then that his shovel hit something hard that made a sound different from stone. Removing the earth carefully, he found what looked like a fragment of painted pottery. Dorothy, come see this, he called, showing the piece in the palm of his hand. The fragment was small, but had designs that looked like flowers, painted in blue on a white background. It was clearly very old and in excellent condition. This seems to be from a very old period indeed. How beautiful this design is, said Dorothy, examining the piece carefully. They continued digging and found more fragments, some larger, which seemed to have been part of plates or jars. Harold also discovered what appeared to be very old coins, covered in a green layer of oxidation. The day was ending when they decided to stop. They had uncovered the complete outline of the old structure, which was approximately 4 meters by 6 meters. It was small, but clearly had been built with care and purpose. Harold, do you have any idea what this might represent? Asked Dorothy on the way back home. I know it's important, Dorothy. I feel it here, he replied, touching his chest. That night they researched online about archaeological sites and traders in Kentucky. They discovered that finds like theirs could have significant historical value, but also that improper excavations could destroy important evidence. I think we need to talk to someone who understands these things, suggested Dorothy. Harold agreed, but made a reservation. But let's not tell anyone in the family yet, at least until we know exactly what it is. The next morning they called the local university, asking if there was anyone specialized in regional history. They were directed to Professor Thomas Anderson, who taught colonial American history and had been retired for 2 years. Professor Thomas seemed very interested when they described their discoveries. They arranged to meet at the property the following afternoon. Harold spent the morning nervous, organizing the fragments they had found and rereading the documents from the box. What if he says it has no value at all? He asked Dorothy. Then at least we'll know the truth. But from the documents we found, it seems it does, she replied, always more optimistic. Professor Thomas arrived promptly at 2 in the afternoon, driving a small car and carrying a case with instruments. He was a thin man with glasses, who must have been about 60. His eyes lit up when he saw the ceramic fragments. Look at this. This is clearly colonial-era pottery, and by the quality of the designs, it must have come from Charleston, or even from Portugal, he said, examining the pieces with a magnifying glass. When they saw the excavation site, the professor became even more excited. This is really interesting. You've found what appears to be an authentic trader's rest. These structures are rare to find preserved, he said, taking photos with a professional camera. Do you think it really has historical value? Asked Harold, barely able to contain his anxiety. It certainly has historical value. Now, we need to be very careful with the next excavations. If you agree, I can bring some of my students so we can do this the right way, proposed the professor. Dorothy and Harold looked at each other. It was exactly what they hoped to hear, but it also meant it would no longer be their secret alone. What does this mean in practice, Professor? Asked Dorothy. It means you've discovered an archaeological site that needs to be preserved and studied. There are government agencies interested in this type of discovery, And also museums that might want to form partnerships, explained Thomas. And we still own the land? Harold wanted to know. Of course, you are the owners and the discoverers. That gives you certain rights, but also certain responsibilities, said the professor. They agreed that the professor would return the following week with a small team to conduct a more technical excavation. Harold was thrilled with the prospect, but Dorothy noticed he was hiding some worry. "What is it, my love? Aren't you happy?" she asked on the way home. "I am, but I'm thinking about my nephews. When they find out, they'll want a piece," said Harold. "But the land is yours. The will is clear," Dorothy reminded him. "You know Bradley. He's an attorney, and always thought he deserved more than what his father left him." "He'll try something, you can be sure," said Harold with concern. Bradley was the eldest son of Dennis, a 40-year-old man who had never gotten along with Harold. Since childhood, he had shown a greed that made everyone uncomfortable, and as an adult he had become a successful but unscrupulous attorney. 3 days later, while they were on the land supervising the work of Professor Thomas's team, a luxury car appeared on the dirt road. Harold immediately recognized Bradley's black Mercedes-Benz. "Great, the Vulture has arrived," he murmured to Dorothy. Bradley got out of the car impeccably dressed, but clearly annoyed at having to walk on the dirt. He was accompanied by an older man carrying a briefcase. "Uncle Harold, what a surprise to find you here. I heard you've been playing archaeologist," said Bradley with a fake smile. "Bradley, how did you know we were here?" asked Harold, stepping in front of Dorothy. "Oh, news travels fast in a small town. My friend here lives in the area and told me about the activity on Dad's land," said Bradley, indicating the man with the briefcase. Professor Thomas approached, sensing the tension in the air. The team of students stopped working and watched from a distance. "Well, Uncle, I came here to make a proposal. I know you must be spending money on these excavations. How about we split the costs? And the results too, of course," said Bradley, still smiling. "I don't need your help, Bradley. And the land is mine," Harold replied firmly. "Ah, that's what I wanted to talk about. This is Mr. Thompson, an expert in inheritance law. He has some questions about Dad's will," said Bradley, pointing to the man with the briefcase. "Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out." Now, continuing, the attorney stepped forward, opening his briefcase. "Mr. Harold, I've studied your brother's will and found some irregularities. There are indications that he was not of sound mind when he drafted the document, especially considering he left the most valuable land to you," he said in a professional tone. Dorothy felt her blood boil. For the first time in years, she confronted a family member with harshness. What kind of nonsense is this? Dennis was perfectly fine. "Can't you accept that he knew his own son?" she said, pointing at Bradley. "Aunt Dorothy, don't get upset. It's just a legal matter that needs to be resolved." "If everything is correct, there's no problem," said Bradley, but his tone made his true intentions clear. Harold took a step forward, standing face to face with his nephew. "Bradley, your father knew exactly what he was doing, and you know that too. You won't take from me what he wanted to give me," he said in a firm voice. "We'll see, Uncle." "We'll see," replied Bradley, getting into the car. After they left, Professor Thomas approached the couple. "You need to prepare yourselves. If there's a legal challenge to the land ownership, it could complicate our research," he said with concern. "Professor, what can we do?" asked Dorothy. "First, you need a good attorney. Second, it would be good to document everything we're discovering here. The more scientific evidence we have about the site's importance, the stronger your position will be," explained Thomas. That night, Harold couldn't sleep. He paced around the house, thinking about everything that had happened in the last few days. Dorothy watched him from the bedroom door, seeing him wrestle with his own demons. "Come to bed, my love. We'll figure this out tomorrow," she said softly. "How can I sleep, Dorothy? For 40 years I put up with that boy's wickedness, and now that we've discovered something important, he wants to take it all," Harold vented. "But he won't succeed. The truth always wins in the end," said Dorothy, hugging her husband. "Does it really win? He has money, he has lawyers. And what do we have?" asked Harold, his voice full of doubt. "We have the truth, and we have each other." "That's always been enough before," replied Dorothy, kissing his forehead. The next day they sought out a lawyer recommended by a friend. Mr. Richard was a man in his 50s, specializing in family and inheritance matters. When he heard the whole story, he shook his head. "You're right to be worried. Will contests can drag on for years, especially when valuable discoveries are involved," said Richard. "But do they have any chance of winning?" asked Dorothy. "Hard to say. We would need to prove that your brother-in-law was of perfectly sound mind when he made the will. And from what you've told me about the letter and the documents, that seems quite clear," explained the attorney. "And how long can a case like this take?" Harold wanted to know. 6 months to 2 years, depending on the complexity. "But there's something that could help us. If we can prove the archaeological discoveries were known to your brother, that strengthens your case considerably," said Richard. They returned to the property determined to find more evidence. Professor Thomas had brought more sophisticated equipment, and the team was uncovering surprising things every day. One Friday morning, one of the archaeology students called everyone to see his discovery. Buried near what appeared to have been the altar of the old chapel, there was a small wooden chest surprisingly well preserved. "Be careful opening it. The wood might be fragile," warned Professor Thomas. Inside the chest were religious objects, a silver crucifix, a small chalice, and some prayer books with yellowed pages. But what caught their attention the most was a folded paper at the bottom of the chest. The professor opened the document very carefully. It was a kind of register, written in archaic Portuguese, listing the names of traders who had passed through the site between 1798 and 1823. "This here is a historical treasure. It's an original record of the traders' passage. Museums would kill for a document like this," said Thomas, visibly moved. "And is it worth money?" asked Harold. "It's worth much more than money. It's worth knowledge. This tells the story of our region, of our people," replied the professor. Harold felt a strange sense of pride. His rocky land was revealing stories that had been lost for 200 years. Suddenly he understood why Dennis had left that land to him. "Professor, how long do you need to finish the excavations?" he asked. "With the team we have, about 2 months. But if we can get more resources, we can do a much more complete job," replied Thomas. "What kind of resources?" Dorothy wanted to know. "The regional museum has shown interest in a partnership. They would finance the excavations in exchange for displaying the finds, and they would pay you a monthly amount for the concession to use the land," explained the professor. It was exactly what the couple needed to hear. Not only would they preserve the discoveries, but they would also have an income from it. Harold imagined Bradley's face when he found out. But Bradley didn't take long to appear again. This time he brought an even more aggressive lawyer, Mr. Harrison, known in the region for his unconventional tactics. "Mr. Harold, my client has informed me about the supposed discoveries on this land. We want to make it clear that any find will be shared among all the heirs, since the will is to be annulled," announced Harrison arrogantly. Dorothy exploded. "What nerve! Now that we've discovered something important, you show up. Where were you when you thought it was just a pile of rocks?" "Ma'am, please maintain your composure. We are talking about legal rights," said Harrison disdainfully. It was then that Harold did something Dorothy had never seen in 42 years of marriage. He put his arm around her waist, pulled her close, and said loudly enough for all to hear, "Mr. Harrison, this woman has worked by my side her whole life. She supported me when I had nothing, put up with me when I was wrong, and now she's here with me discovering the history of our country. If you cannot treat her with respect, you can leave right now," said Harold, with a firmness that impressed everyone. The gesture moved not only Dorothy, but the entire team of archaeologists who witnessed the scene. It was the first time Harold had publicly shown how much he valued his wife. Bradley turned red with anger. "What a beautiful scene, Uncle. But that changes nothing. Dad left this land to you because he thought it was just useless rock. If he had known what was under here, he would have left it to me," he said venomously. That was the last straw for Dorothy. She slipped out of her husband's arm and went toward her nephew. "Bradley, you are a spoiled boy who became a greedy man. Your father knew your character very well. That's why he left the land to Harold, because he knew he would take proper care of whatever was found here," she said, her index finger almost touching Bradley's nose. "Look who's talking. The woman who married a stonemason because she couldn't get anything better," Bradley retorted maliciously. Harold took 2 steps and stood face to face with his nephew. For a moment, everyone thought there would be a physical confrontation. but he only said in a low and controlled voice, "Bradley, I built houses that are still standing after 40 years. You make contracts that only serve to rob people. Now choose. Either you leave here willingly or I'll carry you out," he said, his fists clenched. Bradley stepped back, realizing he had gone too far. He got in the car with the lawyer, but shouted through the window, "This isn't over, Uncle. We'll see who wins in court." After they left, a heavy silence fell over the place. Professor Thomas was the first to speak. "You're going to need a lot of strength to face this, but know that you have our full support," he said, touching Harold's shoulder. That night, Dorothy and Harold talked late about everything that was happening. For the first time in a long while, they spoke openly about their feelings and fears. "Harold, are you afraid of getting old?" Dorothy asked suddenly. The question took him by surprise. He was silent for a long minute before answering, "I'm afraid of becoming useless, of being just another old man who's in the way. That's why this discovery is so important to me," he confessed. "And I'm afraid you won't need me anymore. Sometimes I feel invisible in your life," said Dorothy, tears beginning to flow. Harold turned to her in bed. "Dorothy, how can you think that? You are the reason I've made it this far. Without you, I would have given up on everything a long time ago," he said, drying her tears. "But you never tell me these things. 40 years married, and you hardly ever show what you feel," she complained. "You're right. I'm terrible at talking about my feelings, but today when I defended you in front of those lawyers, I felt such great pride." "Proud to have you by my side," said Harold, kissing his wife's forehead. "Promise we'll talk more." "That we'll take better care of each other?" asked Dorothy. "I promise. And I promise we'll face this fight together, like we always have," he said, holding her close. The following days were filled with intense work at the archaeological site. The team was uncovering more and more evidence of the location's historical importance. Besides the chapel, they found remains of stables for the animals and even gold coins from the colonial period. Professor Thomas was ecstatic. "You have no idea the treasure you've discovered. This will become a reference for studies on the traders' route," he said, showing photos of the latest findings. "And the museum? Have you spoken with them yet?" asked Dorothy. "I spoke with them yesterday. They're preparing a formal proposal. They want not only to display the findings, but to turn the site into a tourist attraction," explained Thomas. Harold grew concerned. "Tourism? Won't that turn our discovery into a circus?" No. It would be cultural tourism. Schools would visit, historians, people interested in the region's history, and you would receive a percentage of all tickets sold," reassured the professor. The proposal seemed too good to be true. But before they could celebrate, they received a legal notice. Bradley had officially contested the will and obtained an injunction preventing any commercialization of the land until the case was resolved. "Does this mean we can't make a deal with the museum?" Dorothy asked Attorney Richard. "Not for now, but the injunction doesn't stop the scientific excavations, and the more historical evidence you gather, the better for the case," explained Richard. "And how long will this process take?" Harold wanted to know. "I managed to schedule a hearing for 2 months from now. That's fast by the court standards," said the attorney. 2 months felt like an eternity to the couple. Harold began suffering from insomnia, spending the late nights thinking about everything that could go wrong. His blood pressure rose, and Dorothy insisted he see a doctor. Dr. Williams, the family doctor for over 20 years, got straight to the point. "Harold, you need to control this stress. At our age, these things take a heavy toll on the heart," he warned. "But doctor, they want to take from me the only important thing I've ever achieved in my life," Harold confessed. "And you think your wife isn't important? That the years of honest work weren't important? Harold, you're tying all your self-worth to a discovery. That's not healthy," said the doctor. Dr. Williams's words echoed in Harold's mind. That night, he and Dorothy had one of the deepest conversations of their marriage. "Dorothy, do you remember why you married me?" he asked suddenly. "Of course I remember. You were the hardest working and most honest man I knew, and you had a way of making me laugh like no one else could," she replied, smiling at the memory. "And now? Do you still think that of me?" he asked, insecure. "Harold Mitchell, you're still the same man who won me over. The difference is that now I can see how much you've grown, matured, become even more special, said Dorothy, touching his face. Sometimes I'm afraid you only love me because you're used to me, Harold confessed. My love, I didn't get used to you. I keep choosing you every single day, even when you're stubborn, even when you don't say what you feel, because you are a good man, and that will never change, said Dorothy, with tears in her eyes. In that moment, Harold understood that regardless of what happened with the land, he had already had the greatest treasure of his life by his side for 42 years. The excavations continued, and each day brought new discoveries. The team found personal belongings of the traders, period tools, and even personal letters preserved almost miraculously. One of these letters particularly caught Professor Thomas's attention. It was from a trader named Walter Peterson, written to his wife in 1804. In the letter, he described the hardships of the journey, but also the hope of returning home. "Look at this interesting coincidence," said Thomas, showing the letter to the couple. "The trader's name was Walter, just like your neighbor who knows the stories of the region." "Do you think you could be his descendant?" asked Dorothy. "It's possible. Many families have remained in the region for generations," replied the professor. They decided to show the letter to their neighbor Walter. When he saw it, his eyes filled with tears. "Good heavens! My great-grandfather's name was Walter Peterson. My grandmother always said he had been a trader," he said with a choked voice. The discovery created an even greater connection between the couple and the local community. People from the region began visiting the archaeological site, bringing stories and objects their ancestors had left behind. Mrs. Beatrice, an 80-year-old lady, brought an old rosary she said had belonged to her great-great-grandmother. "I always heard she had received this rosary from a priest traveling with the traders. Could it have been here?" she asked with shining eyes. Professor Thomas examined the rosary and confirmed it was from the same period as the site's findings. The piece was incorporated into the discoveries, and Mrs. Beatrice was proud to learn her family was part of that history. These human connections to the discoveries further strengthened Harold and Dorothy's position. They weren't just preserving old objects, but rescuing the history of entire families. 1 week before the court hearing, they received an unexpected visit. It was an elegant man, about 50 years old, who introduced himself as Mr. George Patterson, director of the Gold Museum of Dahlonega. "Mr. Harold, Mrs. Dorothy, I've come here with a proposal that could change everything," said Mr. George. "What kind of proposal?" asked Harold, suspicious. "Our museum, in partnership with the Institute of Historic Preservation, wants to declare this site a state cultural heritage. This would guarantee permanent legal protection and resources for maintenance," explained the director. "And what does that mean for us?" Dorothy wanted to know. "It means you would become the official guardians of the heritage. You would receive a monthly salary from the state and would still retain all rights to the land," said Mr. George. The proposal was tempting, but Harold wanted to understand better. "And if my nephews win the lawsuit, could they cancel this agreement?" "No. Once declared heritage, the protection is permanent regardless of who the legal owner is. But of course the ideal is for the lawsuit to be resolved in your favor," explained the director. That night the couple discussed the proposal late into the evening. Being guardians of a historical heritage was a great responsibility, but also an honor they never imagined having. "Harold, do you realize what this means? Us, a simple couple from the outskirts, taking care of America's history," said Dorothy, amazed. "I do, my love. And I also realize that your brother Dennis knew this would happen. That's why he left the land to me," said Harold. "Do you think he discovered all this and didn't tell anyone in the family?" asked Dorothy. "I think he knew his own children very well. He knew that if he told them about the discoveries, they would turn everything into a fight over money," said Harold with sadness. The day of the hearing finally arrived. The courthouse was packed. Besides Bradley and his lawyers, there were representatives from the museum, Professor Thomas with some students, and several residents from the region who had come to support the couple. The judge, Judge Crawford, was a serious man in his 60s. He listened carefully to the arguments from both sides. Bradley's attorney argued that Dennis was not in a sound mental state to make a fair will, leaving the most valuable land to his brother. Your Honor, it is obvious that the deceased was not aware of the land's true value. Otherwise, he would have divided it equally among all his children, argued Mr. Harrison. It was then that Attorney Richard presented the letter Dennis had left in the buried box. Your Honor, this letter unequivocally proves that the deceased knew exactly what he was doing. He was aware of the land's historical value and consciously chose to leave it to his brother, said Richard. The judge examined the letter and the historical documents found. He also heard the testimony of Professor Thomas about the archaeological importance of the discoveries. Professor, in your technical opinion, could these excavations have been done by just anyone? Asked the judge. No, Your Honor. It required technical knowledge, patience, and great care. If the land had fallen into the wrong hands, we could have lost irreplaceable historical evidence, replied Thomas. It was then that something unexpected happened. Dorothy asked to speak. Your Honor, may I say something? The judge agreed, and Dorothy stood up on trembling legs. I met Dennis over 40 years ago. He was an intelligent and fair man. When he left the land to my husband, it wasn't out of malice toward his children. It was because he knew Harold's heart. He knew he would take care of it, as if it were the most precious thing in the world, said Dorothy, her voice steady despite the emotion. And he truly did, she continued. My husband worked under the sun, dug with his own hands, studied the history of the place, not for money, but because he respected his brother's memory and the importance of what we found. Dorothy's testimony moved everyone in the courtroom. Even Bradley seemed shaken by his aunt's words. The judge withdrew to make his decision. The wait lasted 2 hours that felt like an eternity. When he returned, his expression was serious. After analyzing all the evidence presented, especially the letter left by the deceased, and the care with which the archaeological discoveries were conducted, this court recognizes the full validity of the will, announced the judge. Furthermore, he continued, considering the historical importance of the discoveries and the fundamental role of the defendants in their preservation, I order that all court costs be paid by the plaintiffs. Bradley turned pale. Not only did he lose the case, but he would also have to pay a considerable sum in court costs. His lawyers tried to argue, but the judge was inflexible. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd awaited the result. When Harold and Dorothy emerged victorious, they were met with applause and hugs. Professor Thomas was beaming. Now we can make everything official. The land is definitively yours and we can proceed with the museum project, he said, hugging the couple. On the way home, Dorothy and Harold traveled in silence, still processing everything that had happened. It was only when they reached their simple street on the outskirts of Indianapolis that reality hit them. We did it, Dorothy. We really did it, said Harold with tears in his eyes. We did it because we were together. As always, replied Dorothy, kissing her husband. Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we are just starting out. Now continuing. In the following months, the land was completely transformed. The museum built a small visitor center with explanatory panels about the history of the traders and the importance of the rest stop. The excavations continued, always supervised by Harold and Dorothy. The couple moved into a simple house built near the archaeological site. Every day they received visitors, students from local schools, tourists interested in history, researchers from universities. Harold discovered he had a knack for explaining the discoveries to visitors. His experiences as a stonemason helped him explain how the old constructions were made. Dorothy, in turn, specialized in telling the human stories behind the finds. Look at this letter, Dorothy would say to a group of students. It was written by a trader to his wife over 200 years ago. He speaks of missing her, of the dangers of the journey, but also of the hope of returning home. It's just like our feelings today, isn't it? The students were always impressed by the affectionate way Dorothy spoke about people from the past, as if they were neighbors she knew personally. 6 months after the court victory, they received a visit from a television documentary filmmaker. He wanted to make a program about elderly couples who discovered new purposes in life. Mrs. Dorothy, what has changed in your lives after this discovery? Asked the reporter. Oh, my dear, everything changed, but not because of the money or the fame. It changed because we discovered we can still do important things, even at our age, replied Dorothy. And you, Mr. Harold? Asked the reporter. I discovered that life didn't end when I retired. In fact, I think the most important life is just beginning now, said Harold, looking at his wife affectionately. The program aired on a Sunday night and had a great impact. Harold and Dorothy began receiving letters from elderly people all over Brazil, telling their own stories and asking for advice on how to find new purposes in their later years. One of the letters that moved them the most was from a 70-year-old widow who wrote, "After watching you on television, I found the courage to start writing my memoirs. I always thought my life had nothing interesting to tell, but you showed me that every life has value and every story deserves to be preserved." "Look at this, Harold. We're inspiring people," said Dorothy, rereading the letter. "It's funny how life works, isn't it? We thought we were just taking care of some old stones, but we're actually helping people discover their own worth," said Harold. 1 year after the first discoveries, the archaeological site was already receiving over 1,000 visitors per month. The couple's monthly income had increased significantly, but they continued to live simply. "What are we going to do with all this money, my love?" asked Dorothy one day. "I've been thinking about that. What if we created a scholarship for young people from the region who want to study history or archaeology?" suggested Harold. The idea excited Dorothy. They contacted the local university and created the Dennis Mitchell Fund to support underprivileged students interested in historic preservation. The first beneficiary was an 18-year-old young man, the son of farm workers, who dreamed of becoming an archaeologist. "Mr. Harold, Mrs. Dorothy, you are changing my life," said the young man Tyler on the day he received the scholarship. "No, my son. You are the one who will change many people's lives by preserving our history," replied Harold, moved. 2 years after the discovery, something unexpected happened. Bradley appeared at the archaeological site, alone, and with an expression the couple had never seen on him before: humility. "Uncle Harold, Aunt Dorothy, can I talk to you?" he asked, clearly nervous. Harold grew tense, but Dorothy signaled for him to let Bradley speak. "Of course, Bradley, sit here," she said, pointing to a bench under a tree. I came to apologize for everything. Out of greed, out of malice, for having doubted Dad's sanity," said Bradley, avoiding looking directly at them. "What happened, Bradley?" "Why this change?" asked Dorothy, genuinely curious. "My youngest son is doing a school project on local history. When he discovered that his great-grandfather had left an archaeological site to his great-uncle, he was proud. He asked if he could visit," explained Bradley. "And," encouraged Harold, "I brought him here last week. When I saw you explaining the history to him, I saw the sparkle in my son's eyes. I understood what Dad really wanted to do," said Bradley, his voice breaking. "He didn't want to punish me by leaving the land to you. He wanted to ensure the discoveries were treated with the respect they deserve. And I only thought about the money," he continued with tears in his eyes. Dorothy touched her nephew's arm. "Bradley, your father loved you, but he knew your weaknesses too. He didn't leave you the land because he knew you would turn all of this into a financial matter instead of a historical one." "And I proved him right, didn't I?" said Bradley bitterly. "But you can still change that," said Harold, surprising everyone, including himself. "How so, Uncle?" "You're an attorney. You can help us with the legal part of the project, with contracts, with the expansion of the site. If you want to be part of this in an honest way, there's room," offered Harold. Bradley was silent for a long moment. When he raised his head, there was a new determination in his eyes. "You would do that? Even after everything I did?" "Bradley, family is family, and your father, despite everything, was my brother. If you've really changed, we can try," said Harold. The reconciliation wasn't immediate, but gradual. Bradley began visiting the site regularly, bringing his children and helping with the project's legal matters. Little by little, he rediscovered the pride of being part of that family. 5 years after the first discoveries, the Traders' Rest archaeological site had become a national reference. Harold, now 72, continued giving guided tours every morning. Dorothy, at 70, had written a book telling the story of the discoveries and their impact on the local community. The book was called Speaking Stones, a story of love, family, and discovery, and became a regional bestseller. Dorothy had never imagined she would become a writer at 70. "Harold, can you believe we wrote a book?" asked Dorothy, flipping through the signed copy. "I believe you wrote a book." "I just helped with some memories," replied Harold, always modest. "No, my love, we wrote it together, like we've done everything in our life," insisted Dorothy. The book's success brought invitations for lectures at universities and events about active aging. The couple traveled to several cities in rural Kentucky, telling their story and inspiring other seniors not to give up on their dreams. At one of these lectures, a lady from the audience asked a question that made them reflect. "Mrs. Dorothy, if you could go back in time, would you do anything differently?" Dorothy looked at Harold and answered, "You know what I would do differently? I would have talked more with my husband all these years. I would have shared more of my feelings and listened more to his. Because we discovered we are even stronger when we are truly united." "And I," said Harold, "would have shown more how much I love and admire this woman. I spent 40 years being grateful in silence when she deserved to hear it every day." The answer moved the entire audience and became one of the most memorable moments of their talks. At home, after one of these trips, they were sitting on the porch of the house they had built near the archaeological site. The sun was setting between the Kentucky mountains, painting the sky orange and pink. "Dorothy, do you remember the day we got that call about the inheritance?" asked Harold. "How could I forget? You were like a wild man, saying you were going to show everyone it wasn't a useless piece of land," said Dorothy, laughing at the memory. "And you begging me to sell it without even seeing it," Harold recalled. "Yes, my love. But do you know what the most important day in this whole story was?" asked Dorothy. "Which one?" "The day you stood up for me in front of those lawyers, when you hugged me and said I was your partner for life. That day, I understood that all the discoveries in the world were worth nothing compared to what we have," said Dorothy, with tears in her eyes. Harold took his wife's hand. "You know what I've discovered all these years, that the real treasure wasn't buried in the ground. It's been by my side for 47 years, and I was too foolish to show it," he said, kissing Dorothy's hand. That night, they did something they hadn't done in decades. They danced, without music, just holding each other in the silence of the porch, swaying slowly under the starlight. Two elderly people who had rediscovered not just an archaeological site, but most importantly, the love they had always had for each other. 10 years after the first discovery, the Traders' Rest archaeological site had become a national landmark. Harold, now 77, still took his daily walks through the site, but now he was accompanied by a team of young archaeologists who affectionately called him Mr. Harold, the Discoverer. Dorothy, 75, had written 2 more books, one about traditional Kentucky recipes and another about life stories of elderly couples. She had become a sought-after speaker at events about aging and relationships. The couple had created a foundation that had already given scholarships to more than 50 young people interested in archaeology and historic preservation. Many of them returned to work at the site itself or on similar projects in the region. Bradley, who was now 45, had become the foundation's official attorney and one of the main advocates for regional historic preservation. His children, now teenagers, spent their vacations working as junior guides at the site. "Grandpa Harold," said Brandon, Bradley's 15-year-old grandson, "don't you get tired of telling the same story every day to the visitors?" "Brandon, every person who hears our story for the first time is discovering something new about themselves, about the value of persistence, the importance of family, about never giving up on dreams. How could I ever get tired of something like that?" replied Harold, adjusting the cap he always wore on guided tours. The young man smiled, understanding why his grandfather remained so enthusiastic after all these years. On a Sunday morning, 10 years and 3 months after finding the first buried box, Dorothy woke up and didn't find Harold in bed. She searched the house and found him sitting on the porch, watching the sunrise over the archaeological site. "What is it, my love? Couldn't sleep?" she asked, sitting beside him. "I was thinking about Dennis, about how he knew all this was going to happen," said Harold pensively. "Do you think he imagined it would come to all this?" asked Dorothy. "I think he knew my heart better than I did. He knew I wouldn't give up until I discovered the truth. "And he knew you'd be by my side, like you always were," said Harold. "Do you regret anything?" asked Dorothy. "Just one thing, that it took me 70 years to discover that I'm a lucky man. Lucky to have you, lucky to have found a purpose, lucky to have managed to do something that will last after we're gone," said Harold, taking his wife's hand. "Harold Mitchell, after 47 years married to you, can I say one thing?" said Dorothy. "You may. You've always been stubborn, always been proud, always been difficult to deal with, but you've also always been the most honorable man I've ever known. And today, seeing everything we've built together, I can say I'd do it all again. 1,000 times," said Dorothy, kissing her husband's forehead. In that moment, the two understood that the true discovery had not been the archaeological site, nor the historical objects, nor even the recognition they received. The true discovery had been rediscovering each other after decades of marriage. As they watched the movement of the day's first visitors arriving at the site, Dorothy said, "You know what makes me proudest in this whole story?" "What?" asked Harold. "It's that we proved life doesn't end at 60, 70, or 80. That there's always time to start over, to discover new things, to be useful to the world," said Dorothy. "And we proved that a marriage can renew itself at any age. That it's never too late to improve, to know each other better, to love more," added Harold. As he had every day for the past 10 years, at exactly 9 in the morning, Harold headed to the entrance of the archaeological site to welcome the day's first group of visitors. It was a group of students from a school in Indianapolis, accompanied by a young and enthusiastic teacher. "Good morning, children. I'm your Harold, and this here is Mrs. Dorothy. We are the guardians of this special place. Who wants to hear the story of how we discovered a treasure buried 200 years ago?" said Harold, with the same enthusiasm as the first day. 20 small hands shot up in the air, and 20 pairs of eyes sparkled with curiosity. Dorothy smiled, seeing in her husband the same determined man who had refused to sell a rocky piece of land without first understanding it. "It all began," said Harold, walking toward the spot where they found the first box, "when my brother left me what everyone thought was just a useless pile of stones." And so, once again, the story began anew. The story of two elderly people who proved it's never too late to discover treasures, whether they are buried in the earth or hidden within one's own heart. End of story. Now tell me what you thought of this moving story about Harold and Dorothy. Do you believe it's possible to start over and find new purposes in your later years? Leave your honest opinions in the comments. Which part of the story touched your heart the most? Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed the story, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other inspiring stories like this one. Thank you so much for joining us.